Dog's ready to go. You saw my Trump piñata back there. Here we go. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always been an honor to share with you information, news, analysis about what's going on in Mexico, both in English and in Spanish. So I really appreciate you joining us this weekend. One of the issues, in addition to all the political issues and the security issues that we've been discussing here on this show throughout the last couple of months, but another issue that is being highlighted or starting to be discussed more and more is the fact that Mexico is one of the hosts for the FIFA World Soccer Championship. And then one of the reasons why it came up this week is that it's because the Prime Minister of Canada was in Mexico. There was a very, I would say, very successful meeting for President Claudia Sheinbaum and for the Prime Minister. It was, I don't know how many of you saw the press conference, but it was one of the most normal press conferences that I've seen in a long time. Here in Mexico, one could almost say it was almost boring, and boring right now is a good thing. And one of the things that did come up and was highlighted is that Canada, Mexico, and the United States, of course, are hosting. These three countries are hosting the World Cup next year. And I don't know how many of you saw the images, but there was an exchange of gifts, and President Claudia Sheinbaum had given the Prime Minister a soccer ball that had certain types of carvings. It was a beautiful soccer bar, but it was kind of surrounded by all these beads. It was beautiful. So when he came to Mexico, the Prime Minister also gave her President Claudia Sheinbaum a soccer ball. So it was very symbolic, but very important, because we are less than a year away for the most important sports event in the world. Now, another reason why this issue, or the fact that Mexico is one of the co-hosts of this sports event, is that it starts to be some question marks as to whether Mexico is ready for this big event. We had last week, we had this horrible accident in which a pipe that was full of gas blew up. Now, there's more than 25 people who've died up until now. They were burned. And it raised the question as to whether is Mexico ready for a massive accident or a massive tragedy. And it seems that at least right now, the hospital systems in Mexico City, I think it's an issue of concern, at least for some of the analysts. But another issue that is coming up, of course, is the security issue. The soccer, at least here in Mexico, the games are going to be taking place in three cities, in Monterrey, Mexico City, and Guadalajara. And I would like to focus on the city of Guadalajara today, because my friend Beth Sheridan, she's the former head of the Washington Post, or corresponsalía del Washington Post here in Mexico City. She's now a fellow at the Mexico program at the Inter-American Dialogue. One of her last story that was published had to do with the issue of security in the city of Guadalajara, and more particularly with the issue of the disappearances. I want to welcome Mary Beth Sheridan. Welcome to the show, Mary Beth. It's so good to have you once again here on Living in Mexico. The title of your story, the last story you published here in Mexico, was the city where young people mysteriously disappeared. The World Cup city where young people mysteriously disappeared was the title of this extraordinary report. And it really attracted, I think, the attention of a lot of people, because it does raise the question about security in Mexico at a time where, depending on the data, there's still a question mark whether violence is going up or down, but clearly the disappearances have been going up since President Claudia Sheinbaum was sworn in as president. So, welcome to the show, Mary Beth. Just walk us through this story, and then we'll start trying to analyze why Guadalajara. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Nice to be here, Ana Maria. Yeah, I thought Guadalajara was a really interesting city to focus on because it is one of the three host cities in Mexico for the World Cup. Obviously, we're talking about a city that has been called the Silicon Valley of Mexico, a ton of high-tech businesses, very modern, a lot of foreign investment. I mean, this is not some remote rural place or where one might not ever visit. I mean, this is a really in many ways cosmopolitan, important city, and yet it's in a state, Jalisco, that has the highest number of recorded disappearances in Mexico, and Guadalajara is and its surrounding municipalities is really the epicenter of that. So you're really looking at a place where two kinds of realities exist at once. And I thought it was an interesting time to look at Guadalajara, both because the World Cup is coming, some games will be played there, some matches, but also it's at a moment when the UN has put an important focus on Mexico for the issue of disappearances. And I wanted to look at a city where this problem is really intense and try to understand both what it says about Mexico and the whole situation of security in the country. So Guadalajara was the place to go, I thought.
Well, I mean, what's incredible about your story is that you're basically, putting down on paper what we all know is that Mexico is a country where people disappear. And you and I'm sure you may have your own data. I may have my own data, but we're talking more than 100,000 people since in the last 20 years. So I'm still surprised that this issue has not become an important aspect of the discussions of Mexico and Canada and the United States as they prepare for the World Cup. But it's just hard to imagine how it's not going to be an issue, especially since they have these kind of horrendous recent cases of, these ranches where they're finding pieces of people, bodies, clothes. It seems like it was a recruitment center. I'm sure, you talk about it in your story. But, I mean, why? I mean, let me just ask you this first question. Why has this not been a bigger issue?
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that when tourists come to Guadalajara for the World Cup, I don't think they will be confronted personally with these gruesome stories or experiences with the disappeared, these ranches where, as you point out, that turn out to be forced recruitment centers and training centers for the cartels and so on. I think on some level, there is a separation. The disappearances do tend to occur in poorer areas. However, I would point out that in Guadalajara, the phenomenon is so widespread that it does also touch the upper classes. And you do see all kinds of people disappearing, whether it's Uber drivers, whether it's students at the universities. I mean, it's a very widespread phenomenon. And I think I was told that more sort of upper class people they don't want to acknowledge sometimes that someone in their family was disappeared because it's seen as a stigma that perhaps there's some involvement with organized crime, even though there's certainly many cases of innocent people being disappeared. And one of the phenomenon that's gotten a lot more attention lately, particularly in Guadalajara, is the whole issue of forced recruitment. The Jalisco cartel, very strong cartel, probably the strongest in Mexico right now, needs manpower, and they kidnap particularly sort of muscular young men. Often they will fool them with ads for being security guards or whatever it is, phony ads, of course. And once these young people turn up for the job, they are essentially kidnapped and forced to go to these training camps. But there's a whole other series of methods in which young people are essentially abducted and forced to to work for the cartel. And the young guy that I wrote about, some of his clothing was found at this place called Rancho Izaguirre, this terrible cartel recruiting and training center that was a big scandal when it was found earlier this year. So the indications are that he himself was taken there. And, it sort of shows you that this crime group has such a giant role in the economy, in the society, that it even needs to replenish its workforce by kidnapping people. That is one of the reasons why people disappear, and it's quite remarkable how extensive the cartel's presence is at all levels, of Guadalajara.
Do we have any sense of numbers? Not only the numbers of those who may or may not have been recruited, but what about people who have recently disappeared in Guadalajara? I mean, is it increasing? Is it getting worse?
What's interesting in Guadalajara is there's a lot of research done by academics there, and I think that combines with very active groups of relatives of the disappeared looking for them. And one of the things between some of the data crunching by the academics and the mothers is they began to find months ago now that a lot of people were disappearing in the main bus terminal of Guadalajara, which is technically in Tlaquepaque. And so they began to kind of glimpse that there was this phenomenon that previously had been less evident. There'd been some signs of it, but not such clear evidence. And people were being lured by these fake ads to the bus station and then being picked up. Their telephones were taken away from them. And so that was where their loved ones usually had the last contact from them, was at the bus station. So you are seeing different kinds of phenomena, and it's a very difficult thing to track. I mean, there's been some studies by academics trying to model how much recruitment goes on by cartels. And there was a study that came out in Science, I believe 2 or 3 years ago, that estimated something like 300 to 350 people a week are being recruited by cartels because they have such a need for manpower. They've become so huge and gotten into so many different activities. Now, recruitment means in many cases, people are willingly recruited. They choose to go work for a cartel because of the money or a sense of, a life with certain luxuries, let's say, big cars, guns, and so on. But there's a component of it which seems to be because even with the regular recruitment, let's just say, they just can't get enough people to, particularly the Jalisco cartel, which is launching so many wars nationwide, really making a big effort for territorial control. So they just need a lot of employees. And I think some of the revelations, particularly with the discovery of this Rancho Izaguirre, this ranch in the spring, it was one of those rare times where you just saw physical evidence of just how organized and profound this phenomenon is.
Mm-hmm. So, it just raises the question why it has been so difficult for Mexico to stop or at least diminish the number of people being disappeared in this country. I know, throughout your years that you were a correspondent here in Mexico, I know this is one of the issues that you've been thinking about a lot. But it is, I'm still amazed when you look around the world at even countries who are at war, you just don't have those numbers of people who disappear. And you would have thought that by now, and of course with there used to be a lot of international pressure and even political pressure here in Mexico, that the Mexican government and the state's governments would have figured out a way to at least start diminishing this phenomena, especially if they know, like around the city of Guadalajara, a lot of the disappearances are linked to recruitment and young people looking for jobs. So what's your take on this? Why is it this has been so difficult for Mexico?
Yeah, well, one of the things that really piqued my interest in this was that the UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances in April delivered a report in which they essentially alleged that in Mexico, disappearances were occurring in what they called a generalized or systematic way. And the language they used basically said this was not just organized crime groups, but that the government was complicit. Now, the government, of course, has denied it, said, no, of course not, it's organized crime and so on. But I think the key is that the UN group is looking at whether the government either is acquiescent with criminal groups or supports them or, provides some level of, freedom of action to these groups. And when you look at the case of Rancho Izaguirre, it was located in a town where allegedly the mayor has been arrested and allegedly received, I believe it was $3,500, the equivalent per month, to supply police and other kinds of support to this narco training camp. So there's a really profound issue of corruption in which, whether it's police, whether it's mayors or others, are involved in these disappearances. So that speaks to just the really deep penetration of government institutions, security institutions, and political ones by these organized crime groups. And I think that for politicians, it's a tough one to take on because their own, mayors or public officials may have links to all this. So there's just not been an effort. I mean, one of the people I interviewed talked about, the real problem here is impunity. This was the former rector of the University of Guadalajara. And he said, look at, the rate of solving these cases. It's incredibly low. Very few people are ever convicted of involvement in disappearances. And when you have that sort of inability or unwillingness of the government to prosecute people, to control this, then of course the practice becomes much more widespread.
Joining us today here on Living in Mexico is Mary Beth Sheridan. She's the former chief correspondent for the Washington Post here in Mexico. The last article she published was about this issue, the disappearances in the city of Guadalajara. And of course, any news regarding, these three cities, Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Mexico City, of course, is starting to attract more attention just because, not only because of the tariffs and the negotiations and the bilateral relationship with the United States, and of course, this negotiation that has to take place in order to the renegotiation of the USMCA. But of course, for 2026, not only are we looking at this renegotiation or revaluation of the USMCA, but also the World Cup. And, some of these issues, important issues that could affect Mexico's ability to implement or to sponsor the World Cup next year. Do you get a sense that there has been a change in strategy, Mary Beth, with President Claudia Sheinbaum? She's been in office for a year now. Some think that there has been a change in strategy in terms of no more abrazos y no balazos, but more willingness by the Mexican government to go after criminal organizations. What I don't know, and maybe you can help us understand this, whether this also includes a change in strategy regarding the disappeared.
Yeah, I think overall she's taken a much more aggressive approach to crime than Lopez Obrador, but it's hard to really see much change in terms of the disappeared. I mean, there was a National Search Commission whose leader quit, I guess about 2 years ago now, essentially saying she was getting pressure from the government to change the numbers of the disappeared. And since then, that commission has pretty much been dismantled. There's really been very little done there. So I do think there is a question of how much the government is willing to acknowledge this problem. And I think one of the issues, too, to look at, whether it's Guadalajara, they've got the World Cup, they don't want the bad press of disappearances, or even if you look at the strategy of crime groups, I think in some cases, you see signs that the government doesn't want high homicide numbers, obviously doesn't want bodies in the streets, some sort of public outcry. So disappearances may be increasing as a tactic by organized crime groups who want to keep the government off their back. So that's a huge problem, that actually there's a political element to this that can be very important.
But also, there's just, in terms of, I guess, resources and trying to understand their strategy, the numbers are staggering. I mean, I think that's part of the problem too. It's just, think about it, 100,000 people that, they don't know where their family member, I mean, their families don't know where they are. And, there's always been these arguments, and maybe you can address that in regards to this number or what this number represents, because at different points, the Mexican government said, well, it doesn't mean they're dead. It just means that their family members don't know where they are. So maybe a big percentage of them are in the United States hiding from ICE. I don't know. But it seems that a relatively large percentage of those people on the list, there's a high potential that they're dead, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that you see the sort of lack of interest of the government in so many ways. Mm-hmm. It's entirely possible that many of these people who are listed, who have been reported as disappeared by their families, are actually in common graves, that the amount of financing and attention to the forensic system, the government just hasn't paid for the medical system, to the morgues and the forensic scientists to be able to process the number of dead that occur in Mexico in violent circumstances. So a lot of bodies are just, tossed into common graves. There's a very poor system for trying to match the DNA of, families with bodies that are recovered. And so there's just a huge number of unidentified bodies that are in the hands of the government. And again, it's just a sign where there's just an unwillingness to acknowledge and to staff up or resource or do the work necessary to process the dead, to really sort of respond to the violence. I think it's not a politically sexy thing to do, but with the numbers that are in, like I said, common graves or in government forensic facilities, it is a really extraordinary situation that one would think would get more attention.
But who is responsible for the disappeared, or reducing the number of people disappeared, or for the strategy to start finding these bodies for this family? Because is it the Ministry of Gobernación? Is it the Attorney General's office? Is the National Guard, which would be the Ministry of Defense? Is it the Navy? I mean, I think also part of the problem is that nobody really is clearly legally or politically responsible for this problem.
Yeah, I would say that during the time in which Carla Quintana was the head of the National Search Commission, she pushed for more rights for her commission, but a lot of the responsibilities legally for finding the disappeared, certainly for exhuming and examining the bodies and so on, a lot of it was really the province of the Fiscalia, of the Attorney General's office. And I think that the protocols are not well developed. I don't think they're really funded or have the personnel that are oriented in that direction. I mean, their main function is obviously solving crimes. And if there's a body, presumably they want to figure out who did it, right? But I think there's a piece of it that you would normally think in any homicide investigation, part of trying to figure out who did it, trying to solve the crime, the murder or the killing, you would want to find the family to figure out if this person had enemies or what their circumstances were and so on. And that piece of the investigation just gets very little attention in Mexico. And there are some people who say it speaks to the poor quality of homicide investigations in Mexico, that, one of the first things you would normally expect investigators to do is find the family, find out, like I said, this person's situation. Did they have enemies? Did they have some disputes going on and so on? And the fact that the effort to find family members is so weak and so poorly developed, it does raise questions about the overall investigative capability in Mexico's crime system.
You know, in a recent meeting of the National Public Security Commission that finally met, it had stopped meeting during the Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador administration, but they have met now that Claudia Sheinbaum is president. What was interesting was some of the statements made by the Secretary of Gobernación, Rosa Isela. And what she basically stated that it was now the state's responsibility to start using these protocols, because apparently there's a protocol when people either disappear or they find bodies, and that in many ways it seemed in her statement that she was also calling on state and local authorities to do more in this regard, especially in trying to reduce violence and to try to lose the disappearance. I just don't know how much resources state governments have, and whether they want to go after these criminal organizations, especially if they have reduced resources, and knowing how dangerous these organizations are. I mean, is the solution in part having to make sure that there's criminal organizations or resources to prosecute these people? I mean, it's kind of it's hard to imagine what a solution looks like, Mary Beth.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is there are states where the police and the government, the political establishment is quite contaminated with involvement with organized crime. So they just don't have an incentive. I think there's places where prosecutors are probably afraid because of the power of organized crime in certain regions, that it's extremely dangerous to do this kind of work. So then there's an issue of resources. It does seem to me that you would ideally want leadership from the federal government, resources, and some sort of partnership, because there can be, obviously, a lot of these crimes are at the state level. They are considered, whether it's disappearances or homicides or whatever. So you would certainly want a lot of involvement at the state level. But to me, it does seem like if there's not a strong federal program or policy and resources, that you're unlikely to get sort of states that simply decide to do a great job. Like I said, I think it's something where states sometimes are caught between, what do we fund, right? And this is an area that they might not be, they might feel like politically it's much better to have more police or new police cars or whatever it is to give the public a better sense of security rather than devoting the money to this. So, I would think it really has to be both. But I think that it also is important to recognize that the problem exists and to start and to look at, as you mentioned, there's issues of prevention. There's issues of response. How do you respond quickly when somebody disappears so that they don't wind up in a grave someplace, which won't be found for years and years and years. There's just so many aspects. There's obviously, with the justice system, the fact that impunity is so widespread and the number of crimes solved is so low that, that obviously will allow people to do more disappearing because they can get away with it, right? So it just seems to me like there's so many fronts on which you have to focus, but I don't see a lot of attention on this as a big problem.
The title of the story is "The World Cup City Where Young People Mysteriously Disappear." Was published on August 30th. It was the last story filed by Mary Beth Sheridan, who is the former she was head correspondent for the Washington Post here in Mexico, and she is now a fellow at the she's a fellow at the Mexico program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Mary Beth, I really appreciate you joining us, and I hope you keep on joining us.
I enjoyed
Thank you
it
so much, and congratulations on the story. It was a really good story.
Thank
We're going
you.
to go to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and you're listening and watching Living in Mexico. Please don't go away. I'll be right back.